system on fire. Military science fiction contest. Books or stories every Wednesday. Military science fiction contest. Discussion, interviews, reviews and rants. Military science fiction contest.
Hey everybody, I'm going to stop futzing with the video and just hit record. I wanted to do a quick book review of a book that I've been thinking about a lot lately. I finished it last week, and the whole time I was reading this book, I was having a very strange experience because for the first time I was reading a military history book that was covering events and things that I lived through. And while I wasn't part of these things directly, like a lot of the events that the author is describing, I was in another part of, in this case, Turkey, watching as the author's unit jumped into northern Iraq and waiting to find out if we were going to go into Iraq after them. So anyway, this book is Connected Soldiers by John Spencer. And I came across John Spencer. He's done the rounds on a lot of podcasts. He's retired from the military, has become kind of a subject matter expert on a number of areas, mostly defense or combat in an urban environment. But this book, Connected Soldiers, is kind of marketed sort of poorly, and there's a few reasons for that. So looking at the cover, like, that's not going to get anybody super excited. I hope they didn't pay a lot for that. But life, leadership, and social connections in modern war. And it really feels like some kind of academic book that is going to get deep into the psychology of how combat works or how soldiers connect during combat. And while it does touch on those things, this book is much more a memoir of what it was like to come up as an NCO, transition into becoming an officer in the U.S. Army. In this case, a second lieutenant, goes into combat in Iraq, comes back, and then goes back to Iraq as a captain, taking over a mechanized infantry company. And then the book ends up full circle as he gets married and leaves the Army, is taking care of his young kids while his wife deploys to Iraq. And in each of these time periods, like, the experience of being in Iraq is just very different from 2003 to 2008. And I think the last instance is 2017. So, and communication is definitely a big part of that, but the meat of the book is really focused on what it's like to be a second lieutenant, what it's like to be a second lieutenant who was previously enlisted, what it's like to be a captain who comes in to take over a company that has some major leadership issues, and what decisions and choices he makes in order to try and turn that company around. This is the kind of book when I first commissioned, there was a whole, reading list of books that you give to a brand new officer. And one of those was like, We Were Soldiers Once and Young. I think I read Colin Powell's biography then. I read a lot of memoirs from World War II, which is one of my favorite genres of military history. Like, coming out of World War II, there used to be just a ton of books published that were, any soldier, sailor, Marine, all the ranks you could imagine. There was a market for that, where somebody just happened to be a writer and told their story. And some of those were made into movies later. So there's a number of, World War II movies that came out of those books. But you could get a view into someone's experience in, World War II, then Korea. I've got a great book that is by a second lieutenant in the field artillery, and it's just about his experience, like, running around in Korea. And you just get a view into these experiences that you don't get in a history book necessarily. And while this is Connected Soldiers is a history book, I would say it's a primary source because you're getting John Spencer's viewpoint into this. And there are good things and there are bad things about that. Like, John Spencer, one of the things I think is kind of funny is he doesn't pull a lot of punches when it comes to people that he doesn't like or thinks that did a bad job. And he really portrays himself as a second lieutenant who is just solely focused on the things that he needs to do to be the best platoon leader, and then captain that he can be. Like, this was the first place that I had seen John Lynn's ideas written down. And I really doubt as a second lieutenant he was thinking about these things, but as a retired professor at West Point, he's thinking about things like, so John Lynn wrote let me check my notes here. He wrote a book called History of Combat and Culture. And so he's got some different subject areas that he thinks affects soldiers in any given situation. And this is one of the reasons I think this book could be helpful or interesting to people that like military science fiction, because one of the things that Spencer also touches on is the similarities in communication styles across time, with like soldiers talking to each other, soldiers sending letters home, soldiers across different militaries. He talks about soldiers in the German army, French army, and a lot of the same information is what they're sharing with their families. So John Lynn talks about culture and social structure in a military organization and institutions, technology and material conditions, logistics and sustainment, collective psychology and cohesion, and then adaptation and interaction. And those are all things that we've touched on in the podcast in one way or another. We just didn't really encapsulate it in that same manner. So the other thing that I think you could really get from this book is just some really great anecdotes about things that Spencer goes through in these different levels when he's an officer, and how he dealt with them in hindsight. Like, it's hard to know exactly without going back and looking at what maybe actually happened. Like, when he's a platoon leader, he has a soldier who shoots an Iraqi in the back during a house clearing exercise because the soldier supposedly said that he was sick of doing it and the Iraqi wasn't complying. And at that time, there was very little outside communication. Like, basically, they landed in Iraq, they jump into Iraq. The unit has no communication with the outside world. All they have is each other and what they're getting, through military channels. So the unit, when one of their soldiers, breaks and does something immoral, they, kind of the body of the unit, they turn on him. Like, they say, yeah, what he did was wrong. And while the soldier's story changes, as far as Spencer explains it, he goes from like having said, yeah, I was sick of this, to I thought the guy had a weapon. And the soldier ends up, he gets sent higher. It goes through various legal processes, and the guy actually ends up getting a very low, like, nothing really happens to him, according to Spencer. And I haven't verified this myself, but you can see things like that's also a thing that's kind of wearing at a new officer that has a very strong moral sense of right and wrong and doing the right thing in this sort of situation. So that was really interesting to read from that second lieutenant's perspective, but also trying to remember that this is, the retired version of Spencer writing what he remembers as a second lieutenant. And then later on, so he, there's a lot of good stuff about just his thought process as he's trying to be a platoon leader, as he's trying to interact with his platoon sergeant, get to know his soldiers, the kind of line between how much of himself he should share with his soldiers and what that feels like. And he actually so he was married when he was with the 173rd in Vicenza, but according to him, his wife ended up, leaving him for some Italian guy. So he has like a Jody story that he can share. And he talks about like that line of how much he felt he should share with the soldiers versus, how much he needed to hold inside so they wouldn't, think less of him. And I think that is a useful thing to think about as a young officer, or if you're a writer, that's some really good character detail that you could, that's a firsthand experience you could have in a story, as some character background. So then when he comes back as a captain, Iraq has changed quite a bit between 2003 and 2008. We've transitioned from the invading army that he was part of to the support and stability army, especially he was near Sadr City, if I remember correctly, outside Baghdad. And he was also moving from light infantry to a Bradley unit, and he was going to take over a Bradley company. And he was never sent to any kind of transition course to learn anything about the Bradley. And one of the things he's really played up is like how important it is for the platoon leader to really deeply understand the equipment that the soldiers are using. So he had been a former NCO, so for him it was very natural to really dig into inspections. I think back to times that I did inspections as a lieutenant, and I just was not aware of the ways that, soldiers can kind of pull one over on you. But also, I really wasn't thinking deeply about, if this is what we have to take, this is what we have, and it needs to work, right? Like, the sleeping bag shouldn't be torn. Like, they need to have the right number of socks. That's like, I'm thinking about an infantry company, I guess, for a Patriot battery. Like, you need to have the right equipment on your launcher. You need to have all your just all the things that come into actually making the equipment work. And I wish that's information I had had when I was a second lieutenant, because he really drives that home. And I think for any new lieutenant that might be reading that would be a really good way to internalize how important that stuff is. Because later when he comes back, and he really wants to know how to use the equipment, as it starts becoming apparent to him that the unit has a lot of problems and he's going to have to come in and make changes, it's going to be hard. And he's like, the way he portrays himself, it's kind of like in a job interview when somebody, my only defect is that I'm too much of a perfectionist, right? But he's the guy writing the book. He's not going to share like a lot of how he felt. He definitely has a lot of worries and concerns when he comes into this unit. And this is a unit that's in active combat. And when he, basically they were defending this location in, I can't remember what part of Baghdad it was in, but it was a secured, it wasn't a fob, but it was basically a secure area where they're running an aerostat up and down. And they had learned that if they brought the aerostat down during the day for maintenance, they would get mortar attacks on them. And so they started doing that at night, but there really wasn't much of anything for the infantry company to do except kind of like vaguely patrol the area and provide support to the units that were running the aerostat up and down. Well, right before he takes over, he's in the middle of his company inventories where they're laying out equipment and things like that. I also thought he doesn't have the platoons lay the stuff out all together. So I was thinking to myself, as he's, talking about how diligent he is with his inventories, I'm like, they're getting over on you because they're shifting equipment around. But basically, somebody drives a truck up to the outside of the compound, and if I'm understanding correctly, it had Haskell barriers, which are kind of these giant, imagine like a fencing material with kind of a mat inside that you fill with just whatever sand and gravel and whatnot you can find. But a truck pulled up next to the compound and managed to lob a bunch of explosives into the compound. And there had been another incident earlier, and so their first sergeant was punishing everybody, and if they went outside, they had to be in full battle rattle. And so a lot of the soldiers just didn't want to go outside and stayed inside their huts. And the ones that were outside all had their protective equipment on. So when all of these propane tanks and other explosives start going off, it just destroys the compound, but they didn't have the casualties they might have had. And so the battalion commander was already having issues with the company commander. They were ready to pull him out, but this basically was the straw that breaks the camel's back. They yank him out. They put Spencer in command. Well, Spencer has been leading up, and he's done a really good job of taking notes on the different platoons, where they're placed. He's got a couple that are tasked out. He's got people that are doing patrols in the neighborhoods, but they have no explanation, according to the soldiers, of what they're doing, no task and purpose. They have no mission. They just go out, they drive around, and they come back and hope they don't get shot. And so as a person, obviously if you were reading this from the outside, you're probably kind of horrified about what happened in Iraq during this time. But it becomes it's part of that larger story of how the Army was forced to do something in Iraq that they just weren't trained to do. The U.S. Army is not a support and stability force. Maybe if you look at the history of Japan and Germany and Korea, but those are very different places than what Iraq was. And so there's a lot of really good background detail there. And I think just from reading a story, if you like this kind of story, that's going to be really compelling, following him through that. And the ways that he is just looking at the soldiers and looking back at it through the lens of a professor that studies communication and talks about how soldiers interact with each other, that's all really interesting and useful stuff. And so he walks through all the things he has to do to rebuild the unit and get them back to winning. And a lot of that really resonated with me because it was very it was the kind of stuff that I was taught as well. Although this is all happening in 2008, and I'm thinking to myself, I got to the Army in 2005, and there's a lot of parallels between. I wasn't an Army Ranger, but I enlisted in the Army the same time he did. I came in active duty, actually a little bit before him as an officer, but then was experiencing a lot of the same things. Well, in 2008, I was trying to manage a Target store, and so like thinking about the things he's doing and like how bummed I was to be at Target, feeling like I wish I was back. I was back in the Army. But it's really, there's just so much like really good detail there as he's walking through that experience, and also the story of how he brings that unit back up. If anything, I wish that he had focused more on the NCOs. Like his first sergeant is really just very checked out, and I couldn't believe that he wouldn't get rid of his first sergeant. And he doesn't talk at all about talking to the command sergeant major or bringing in the battalion commander to get some support there, because it really, the story is the way it's portrayed. It's like he did it all on his own. And just as a former battery commander, I have a hard time believing that. And he really, while he says he has like a really good XO and he has some good platoon leaders, he pulls no punches, like saying when he had a bad platoon leader that he just couldn't couldn't train to be better. And I don't like that. I think that if you were looking at this from a story perspective, I don't like just writing people off. I would want to see some kind of redemption for that person, or him as a person who can make decisions. Like, I get this is a time of stop loss, like it's hard to get rid of people, but some kind of decision has to be made if you've got a bad leader, especially when you're trying to fix the unit. So I was very surprised by those things. He keeps the same, basically a checked out first sergeant the whole time that he's trying to rebuild this company. So that's something that I think was surprising to me as part of this story. So the communication piece, the transition between when they were in Erbil with the 173rd and nobody had any communication outside, and then when he comes back in 2008, they've got the internet. And that is really interesting, because one of the parallels he talks about is that the soldiers, when something traumatic would happen, they would process that together. They ate together, they lived together, because they had no other interaction except themselves. And so he spends a lot of time talking about brotherhood and what brotherhood is, like say in Band of Brothers, brotherhood versus friendship, and how it's different. Like, you in a military unit, you very well might not like people, and I can certainly attest to this, but if you can depend on them or not. And that's really more important than friendship. Like, can I trust you? Can I depend on you? Do you know your job? You may know your job, but will you do your job? And that's something that you really only get through close proximity with people. And in the times that I deployed, like, we had internet, but we didn't have it most of the time we were doing our jobs. So while we might be out at the tactical site, for 12 to 20 hours at a time, you're still stuck with, the people that are with you that whole time. And in fact, I just learned 3 weeks ago that one of my former soldiers passed away, and it really hit me. Like, I haven't, I've talked to him a couple times on Facebook, the way you do things on Facebook, which is just stupid, but it really hit me, and I did in a way I didn't expect. But he talks about that quite a bit. And then when he comes back in 2008, they have the internet. And so when something bad happens, like when the attack on their, the FOB, I'll just call it FOB because I can't remember what they were calling it. When the attack on the FOB happens, they don't necessarily come together to process that. The soldiers are all in their separate hooches, or when they end up going to another location, they're processing it separately with their families. And a lot of them, especially the NCOs who are married, don't want to tell their wives what is actually happening. And so in his opinion, that really affects their ability to process a traumatic event like that. And he has a later story with, soldiers that went through that, and one in particular that maybe the inability to process that led to a suicide later. Like, he can't say for certain, and you don't know, but there's a lot of correlation, or, suicide being the problem that it is, could be tied to the way those communication changes have happened. And he doesn't, he's not making those correlations. He's not saying that. And one of the things I want to make a point about this book is, while it appears to be an academic book focused on communication in units, it's really just much more about his experience as a platoon leader and then company commander. So I would really just recommend this book to any new company grade officer or new company commander. But those communication pieces are very interesting. And so later, when he goes home and he starts dating another lieutenant who is in the brigade, they get married. His career progresses, and then he hits 25 years. Like he ended up staying to 25, and career things happen. He's got to go, and he needs to think through what that transition means for him as a person. And I was really glad to see this in the book because I feel it's something that really, that's a story that does not get told very often. And as a person who lived through it, for me, transitioning out of the Army was hard. And there are times like it took a long time. Still I find myself talking about the Army for no good reason. And I feel like that guy that just won't shut up about, the Army when I'm at work, and people could care less. Or I say on target or something, or, pull the trigger, and people look at me like you're using the wrong language. So I really was glad to see that in a book, someone talking about this. And he talks about it a bit. It's not like he's going to get deep into talking about depression or having to rethink his personality or how he's interacting with people. He does touch on the fact that, most all of his support systems, like the people that stayed in active duty, are not available to him in a lot of ways. Like he misses the fact that when he was part of a unit, it did feel like that connection was there. Like you could join a unit, and that band of brotherhood becomes very felt, where we're both wearing the uniform. I will help you do whatever. We can talk about whatever. It doesn't matter. And as soon as that's gone, you're not going to replicate that anywhere in the civilian world. And especially now that, your spouse is still in and you're not, you're on the outside. And that's not an easy place to be when that's been your entire life, right? So he talks about that. And then when she deploys, he has the kids. And so it's not like he can just go get a new job or go do something else that would occupy his mind. He had agreed to be the father staying home with the kids, and financially they can do that. And so that's what he does. And at least through the way he is describing this, there's not a lot of detail in this piece. It's only about, maybe a chapter and a half that he talks about this. But he's there as much as he can be with the kids, having to help them process the fact that their mom is gone. He's got to process how he feels about that. He also needs to process, like, her career is advancing, at least at that period, in ways that his was not. Like, she's becomes a general's aide, which is usually, a stepping stone to higher, more rank, depending on where you are. And so that is kind of the capstone to the book. And the communication with his wife at that point is almost instantaneous. Like, there are times, like they are both soldiers who lived through 2003 because they met, early on. And there was like a really poignant part of the book where she talks about when she's getting ready to go, she takes off her wedding ring and she tells him, I want you to keep this because if I die, I don't want them to have my ring. And in a different sort of relationship, or they are people in their mid to late 30s at this point. The impression is that it's a very mature relationship. They are both people who have lived with this war for a long time. And so while someone else might look at that and say, oh, she's taken off her wedding ring, blah, 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 you can't trust that. Like, to me, that was a very heartfelt expression of, this is reality, and I want you to have the thing that matters to me if I don't come back. And so she goes, and while she can't talk all the time, it's still very different. Whereas she has, now she's got a phone. They've got SATCOMs. They've got, like, she has an Iraqi phone with Wi-Fi. They have Wi-Fi on the fob where she's at, so that they're pretty much in constant communication. And if the kids want to talk to her, they can. He can talk to her all the time. So it's just very different. And granted, she's a major at this point, I think. And so they have a very different experience than maybe a private. But I think that was still pretty common at that point for there to be broad-based communications. And, other friends I have whose kids are, forward deployed in places you would not expect them to have, ready communication like that, and they have it. Like, maybe they're not taking it out with them on the vehicles, but they can come back and, communicate through social media and whatnot. And speaking of social media, like, he definitely, the impact of Facebook on the military experiences are very interesting in the way that he talks about some of the stories he has with that. Like they get a call or a Red Cross message, which is a way to get messages to soldiers when they're downrange, from a family member of another soldier who was contacted by somebody in the community because the soldier was on Facebook talking about how he was murdering all these Iraqis. And he gets this information, Spencer gets this information as the soldier's company commander, and he knows that the guy's not doing this. So what is this? Why? So he has to pull the soldier in and have a conversation with him about his posts on Facebook and why he's portraying himself as doing this when obviously he's not. And what does that mean? And actually that soldier becomes, like, I think the second one for him at that point, that he sends to get a mental health evaluation, and the soldier never comes back. So that is becoming more of a, something that happens to them. And you hear other stories, from soldiers that lived through it. And it was the same when I was in. Like, you just didn't say, if you were going to go to mental health, you pretty much had to expect that was going to end your career or you get pulled from your unit. And one of the big distinctions he makes also between the unit that he deployed with in 2003 and the unit now, in 2003, none of them wanted to leave. Like, if somebody got wounded, the first thing they would say is, I don't want to leave. I got to stay here and help my brothers. And then later on in 2008, if somebody gets hurt, that's their ticket out, And I think you could make of that what you will, based on just the differences in the mission when they're there during those times and the kind of, conflict they're in and the mental stress that they're under. But there's a lot of story between the lines there as far as being willing to stay when there are, I won't call them easy, but there are paths out. And when I was a commander, it was very difficult to get rid of somebody. I'll just say that. So, because we were at the very beginning of stop loss, rolling into stop loss when I was in command. And then the story basically ends with the end of his wife's deployment. She comes back home, and how difficult that reintegration is that they have to work through. And so he bookends the experience with what he saw before, like through his NCOs when he was not married, and then later on when he is married. And so it gives you the full circle of what is a military career. And I think, if you know anybody that is in the military thinking about, going through deployment, absolutely dealing with, family or communication with family, if they're a new leader, I think there's a lot in this book that can be really helpful for them to think about. Spencer can be a hard character to identify with as he's describing himself, because he's really like the greatest platoon leader you ever met. But, you do the best you can, right? But I think from a military science fiction perspective, this is now far enough in the past, which is also weird to me, that it is kind of easy to think of this as another country, right? Or you could project this into the future, and these experiences are relatively universal, or could fit into any sort of scenario you might think up. So Connected Soldiers by John Spencer. I think it should get a better cover. I think they should rewrite their blurb and sell this book to new company-grade officers, and they'll probably sell a lot more copies. But it is what it is. So I'll put the link to the Amazon information below, and thanks for listening. I'll see what other book reviews we can do in the future. I know we've got some things in the pipeline, so we'll keep sharing them. And let me know what you think. Let me know what you think. Talk to you later. Thanks.